Where does the wisdom of the white man come in? What I want to talk to today is really an article that I wrote for this book, The Study of World Christianity, Approaches, Methods and Case Studies, which will be out sometime later this year. And so you're getting a potted version. But this is part of a kind of loose collaboration that's been going on for a couple of years, thinking about the field of world Christianity, and this is Relocating World Christianity, the book David had just mentioned. So a couple of us have contributed to both books. There were a number of us meeting together to discuss, well, when we say world Christianity, what are we talking about? I'm going to focus most particularly on this issue of using missionary sources. But to give those of you who are perhaps less familiar with world Christianity as a bit of an idea of where I'm starting from, I just wanted to introduce what I'm going to say by saying that studies in world Christianity have often prioritised the variety and local responses by attending to those who are often unrepresented or underrepresented in global church structures. Hence, my first study of a very small Anglican church in a Francophone area of Africa. And we've been fascinated by indigenous populations and their creating of distinct Christian churches, independent of missionary control or Western practice. We've often used oral history methods where possible in order to seek an authentic African voice. And historians who've been seeking to find indigenous perspectives on historical processes of religious change, on Christian development, on transnational influence, frequently are kind of unnerved perhaps by finding an overwhelming amount of European and North American missionary sources. And rather looking at this evidence as kind of flawed in some way, that it's focused on the concerns of missionaries, their societies and supporters, and therefore it must be unrepresentative of the social, political and economic dynamics of communities that missionaries were working amongst. That in some ways it is dismissive of the cultural norms of those communities. So that was one kind of starting point. But around 1990, there was a renewed interest in missionary archives and how they have been helpful in showing us social and cultural change. But perhaps the first of those seminal works that kind of looked at religious and cultural change in Africa using missionary archives, rather saw it as this assault on culture. So the John and Jean Komaroff of Revolution and Revelation examined the response of the Tswana to the London Missionary Society, and they found the encounter deeply problematic and said, well, this is what we see here is a colonization of consciousness. So a first re-examination of missionary archives really seemed to reinforce some of the ideas that perhaps the study of world Christianity had been trying to work against. But the book on the Komaroffs led to a number of works that critiqued their approach, that said the way that they looked at it, the way they used missionary sources, really didn't give very much agency at all to the Tswana, that they described the encounter as a single monolithic encounter rather than as a complex number of different encounters. And that they failed to engage with African texts and with oral narratives. And since then, a number of notions of knowledge and cultural exchanges have been put forth instead. And there's also been a great deal of work on notions of mission and empire in the European context and looking out to the globe, and there's at least 2 people in this room who've written on that subject. I'm very conscious of it. But what I'm looking at today is really these ideas of how we might understand indigenous populations and how missionary sources may help or hinder that process. And so we have 2 broad, very broad understandings. Mission as a kind of cultural exchange, or missionary sources enable us to tell us about cultural exchange. Missionary sources enable us to tell us about a cultural assault on cultures, and that's the Komaroffian view. And of course, we don't need necessarily to see these 2 things as mutually exclusive. It's quite possible that missionary activity and missionary sources, in general terms, can be both assault and exchange. And examining the sources reveals the extent to which any given incident is destructive or supportive of any particular cultural aspect. And the quotation from which my title comes, I think, appears to demonstrate this imbrication of exchange and assault very well. And it comes from an event that took place in Toro in western Uganda in 1904. So very blurry picture, wider picture here, and this is the area that I'm talking about, and the area where my present interest is focused upon. And here, let's try again. Here's the first part of the quotation. We steamed along on our machines under sun hats and big shades, over ridges and through mud. Apollo insisted on keeping pace with the ladies' bicycles, and as a small batch of natives passed on the road, gazing with blank astonishment at these running snakes, he called out with pride and elation, "Look at the wisdom of the white man." This was written by Ruth Fisher, who was still Ruth Herditch when she had this encounter. She was one of the first 2 female missionaries of the Church Missionary Society to work in Toro. And she recounts in some detail an extended safari organised and led by Apollo Kivubulaya to acquaint her and Edith Pike with the peoples of Toro. And Apollo Kivubulaya was a recently ordained Ganda man who was working for the Anglican Church in Toro. He was paid at this stage by the Anglican Church in the central region of Uganda, among the Baganda, and he was later paid by the Toro Church Council. And it was he led this expedition. Now, it's a lovely little story, and I think you can see that it could be read in a number of ways to examine the role of African teachers and priests and their relationship with missionaries. We have the gaze of the bystanders, which could be interpreted as uncomprehending, bewildered, or perhaps even resentful and mistrusting towards overdressed white women propelling themselves on strange constructions. Kivubulaya's adulation of missionary methods of transportation could be understood as a tool in a complex kit for indigenous survival in an oppressive missionary regime. His praise could be understood as that of a sycophantic colonial collaborator displaying false consciousness, or the unconscious propagator of malevolent exterior influence, or perhaps the social go-between copying the ways of missionaries and promoting novel technologies. You might not see all of this in this particular extract, but scholars have read very similar extracts in these various ways. I'm thinking of the Komarovs, and I'm also thinking of the work of wrote Nancy Rose Hunt and her colonial lexicon, in which she very much uses this kind of lens. We could also read Kivubalaya's exclamation as a tongue-in-cheek comment, perhaps, if we knew something more, whose sarcasm was overlooked by a proud and ignorant European. Or maybe it was envy for a vehicle that people like Rose Hunt see as a colonial commodity, a symbolic marker of middle status. But in contradistinction to these readings, which I often see transnational forces as negatively intrusive, always infused with imperial meaning, I think that both Fisher and Kivabalaya are both participating in a sense of excitement, novelty, and adventure. Not always about the same things. And this is partly because I know the next part of the story, but mostly because of the way that I read Fisher's account along with other evidence. So if I can bring the next bit. So here's the next bit of the story. Just as Apollo shouted look at the wisdom of the white man, for the third time, my bicycle tumbled clean into an antpit and was irreparably smashed. The people did not evince any concern or surprise. They evidently considered it part of the show. One of the onlookers was chartered to shoulder the fragments back to Cabaroli. Once more, I was without my bicycle, and I felt sure that the natives must have wondered where the wisdom came in. The journey that Kivubulaya and Fisher and Edith Pike take is an example of a collaboration on a shared but differently perceived commitment to a common cause. It is in those differences of perception that the less obviously documented elements of cultural change, the perspectives of African teachers, may be found. And I'm tending to use the word teachers because that was the word used at the time. In this reading, an amusing, incidental event provides us with a glimpse into a moment of shared perspectives between a Ugandan Christian and a European missionary woman who understood intercultural relationships and novel technologies to be tangible symbols of a global Christian community. An understanding of Fisher's writing and recourse to other sources are required in order to be confident of such an interpretation. I don't really think we can just get it from this story. And so that's what I want to kind of tease out a little bit now before I go on and make some broader suggestions about missionary sources. What's interesting is Fisher's story is found in two sources. It was published in her book On the Borders of Pygmyland in about 1904, which is a travel log, which was composed from a much longer journal made available by Fisher's family with biographical notes as grandma's tracts. So two very similar sources, but there are also references to the journey in the published CMS annual letters of 1901 and in Apollo Kivubulaya's own diary. And the description of events in these versions is very similar, although in some versions just very, very brief. And we can see how closely Fisher adhered to her private notes in describing these events. I think if we read these sources, we can see Fisher's context and her values and opinions, and the figure of Kivubulaya is partially revealed, but only by knowing the background of Fisher. So I'm going to start with those sources first, and then compare with other documents. Fisher's writing is set within late Victorian Anglican missionary evangelicalism, and in the perpetually negotiated emancipatory roles it provided for women. Her bicycle had given her freedom in London. She took it to Uganda to avoid being carried by porters, which until that stage had been a way in which many missionaries, particularly women, had moved around. She'd ridden it very successfully on the wide roads of Buganda, neighbouring Toro, and her bicycle establishes her credentials as a modern missionary woman, credentials that she mocks in this vignette. She doesn't record Apollo's awe at her bicycle from a position of condescension or superiority. She is equally excited about her bicycle, and she ruefully accepts the flaws in her beloved mode of transport on Toro tracks unfit even for a bone shaker. This vignette is embedded in this description of a safari which begins with Fisher's praise of Kivubulaya, so it makes part of a chapter in the published version. Kivubulaya is the experienced traveller. He is her protector and her overseer. And Fisher's misplaced faith in her technology reminds her that she's not so wise or able, and she must look elsewhere for dependability. And Apollo Kivubulaya provides that. She relies on his local knowledge of the people and the places and his interpretation of their societies in order to navigate the journey beyond the Kabarole mission station. And this is what we see frequently in the sources, missionaries depending on indigenous Christians to broker relationships across cultures and negotiate mutual exchange between a missionary or a European culture and the evangelist's own culture, or in the case of Kivubulaya, a neighbouring culture. Knowledge of local society, language and customs gave Africans influence with European missionaries who wished to obtain knowledge and gain trust of local people. And furthermore, Kivubulaya's experience persuades the male European missionaries that the ladies may undertake a potentially hazardous trip. The male missionaries hadn't really wanted any lady missionaries to turn up, and when they did, they had to kind of work out how they were going to respond to them. As it happens, A.B. Fisher, who was most virulent against the arrival of female missionaries, ends up marrying Ruth Fisher. And the account of their courtship is quite amusing, but beyond what we can talk about today. So what we see is Kivubulaya is acting as a chaperone to these women and a liberator. He's enabling the women both to subvert and to conform to Victorian social expectations of their class, which were already being redrawn by missionaries. So in reading missionary texts in this way, we can see that I'm kind of foregrounding the gendered relations and the interaction between Fisher and Kivubulaya, but we can see how that's infused by social and cultural forces from the missionaries' background. Now, relationships between missionaries and indigenous peoples are often illuminated in missionary writings that articulate both lofty aspirations and stern criticism of local cultural practices. And it's quite difficult sometimes to find our way through that. Fisher provides much greater commentary in her published book as she interprets her travels for a wider audience. In the same chapter that this excerpt comes from, she recounts the bicycle incident. She describes the fascination of her encounter with the peoples to whom Apollo introduces her, and she takes to task European biased opinion by countering what she believes to be commonly held assumptions. Oh, I haven't got this quote up. She blames European mistrust for poor relations between Africans and Europeans. Actually, this is Herditch and Pike, and this man here is Kivubulaya with a number of other evangelists, because by 1901 he was also training the evangelists. come on to those photographs later. Oops, sorry. Fisher says, dispel all preconceived ideas, study the people's environment, the internal and external influences that sway them. Approach them not as niggers, but fellow creatures, and the European will never need to complain of the black man's presumption, but will find it even possible to accept the inspired statement, God hath made of one blood all nations of men. So writing back to her audience in the early 20th century, she takes them to task by attitudes that she considers to be widely held. And her reference to Acts 17:26, the authorised version, in this context, is an attack on assumptions of racial superiority and a statement of belief in common humanity. The dependence on Kivu-Bulaya, which Fisher displays, also indicates the way in which their relationship bore out Fisher's biblically based aspirations. And similar respect is present in her popular anthropological account, called by her publishers Twilight Tales of the Black Baganda, a title that she hated, in which royal customs are carefully recounted, and she explains, she interviews, this is Daudi Kasagama, one of the kings that she interviews, the king of Toro, and this is the royal band in her that she also talks about. So she's trying to understand culture, she's taking to task common European assumptions, but she, like other missionary writers, seems to strain at the categories she has at her disposal to explain her experiences to British audiences. And she often presents African people she meets in ways which are conflicted. She sensitively describes character, events, and customs that she admires, whilst also criticising ways of life. For example, Fisher disdains the lack of motivation for material improvement. She sees lethargy, laziness, and lack of interest in the gospel, in a disregard for cotton clothing or durable building material among some of the people she visits. These people are placed in stark contrast to the native teachers who work for calico and gaze wistfully at bicycles. Fisher mocks herself for being overdressed. She asserts that there is no material benefit in becoming a Christian, but nevertheless, she understands the aspiration for cotton and other material novelties as denoting an interest in Christianity. So she doesn't appear to be very consistent if you read her writings clearly. She's trying to work through what this all means. And assumptions about cultural superiority hover through her writings, even while she attempts to hold up a vision of human equality. In passages in which Fisher appears to entirely disregard her own advice and criticises the people she meets, we can glimpse something of a distorted view of the many people who remained hostile or indifferent to missionary programmes. But where possible, missionary sources should be read with other sources in order to examine a number of perspectives at work and to construct ways in which expectations crossed or intertwined or did not. Kivu-Bulaya kept brief notes of his many journeys, and they include travels with other CMS missionaries, and they were kept for over 3 decades. Diary entries confirm that Apollo Kivu-Bulaya's role as teacher and as an Anglican priest included a great deal of travel, that he enjoyed visiting places to preach the gospel or to support new churches, and that he relished the role of guide to missionaries and mediator between them and Indigenous people. For example, in 1931, Apollo records I did have a nice picture of his diary just up there. There you go. He records an itineration with Bishop Willis and Reverend Russell, who both wrote their own accounts that are available in the Church of Uganda archives in Mukono in Uganda. Further comparison can be made with records of journeys of explorers, colonial administrators, and other missionary groups like the White Fathers, who were also operating in Toro. And you can begin to examine patterned behaviour of journeying. And actually we can place missionary itinerations in a longer history of travelling, trading, road construction, of hospitality and hostility. Chiefly guests and wealthy traders moved in style and were greeted with great ceremony. And these expectations of ritual courtesy were also in play when missionaries arrived in different places and when African evangelists arrived. So the use of these comparative sources permits the identification of events that in any one account might appear incidental or be described as idiosyncratic. And so we can begin to see that these transnational encounters are infused by African social and cultural forces. Now, to go back to our little event, Kivubulaya's diaries for his safari with Fisher and Pike are typical in that they are terse and statistical. I'm afraid we don't get any lovely description of how he saw Fisher tumble from her bike. He lists the 10 destinations they visited, and he notes the number of people that gathered to meet them during their itineration. Like Fisher, Kivubulaya also indicates that he considers industrial manual labour to be a virtue. But in contrast to Fisher's attention to idleness, he says that as he went along, he encouraged those people who were working hard. And the people he saw working hard were road constructors, doing the same work that he himself had previously done when he was employed by the king of Buganda a decade or so earlier. And in 1913, Kivubulaya bought his own bicycle. A broken bike may well have demonstrated the foolishness of the European in 1901, but its possibilities for efficient travel were much greater when the labourers had made the Toro roads better suited for wheels. For Kivubulaya, journeying with Fisher and Pike provided the signs of what he'd been preaching. His message of eternal life in Christ was bound up in the material novelties and the benefits of belonging to an international movement in which strangers became siblings. His pale, overdressed fellow missionaries, balanced on strange contraptions, provided a spectacle and a talking point. They lent Kivubulaya credibility amongst those prepared to countenance his teaching. And even the embarrassment of a broken bicycle became an opportunity to draw attention to the benefits of road construction. He and other evangelists relied on performative elements surrounding travel and hospitality in order to draw attention to their message. When read with other documents, Kivubulaya's diary shows the agency of indigenous people and demonstrates that novelties brought by Westerners need not necessarily be understood as homogenizing. Novelties could be vehicles, and literally in this case, by which some local actors chose to engender change on translocal levels. Well, I hope that elaboration of this little story gives you some kind of demonstration of the problems and possibilities of the interpretation of missionary sources. It demonstrates the importance of knowing what kind of source, its audience, genre, and conceptual frames is being used. And what I'd like to do now quite quickly is describe a range of missionary sources in order to argue for 2 points. First, the importance of comprehending the nature and rationale of sources at historians' disposal for effective interpretation. And second, the utility of a comparison of different sorts of missionary writing in order to gain a deep understanding of the context. And these points hinge upon two important issues. Missionary writers were conscious of various audiences, and they wrote according to their audience interests. They wrote for the missionary society that required statistics and demonstrations of diligence, the general public. They wrote for learned societies seeking different forms of knowledge about Africa. They wrote to supporters desirous of information for prayer and financial assistance. And they wrote to close confidants, expecting frank accounts of what they were experiencing. So I'm trying to categorize a few of these missionary sources, but I think we need to think that they were influenced by the perceived interests of potential readers. And the way in which the sources have been organized, archived, and conceptualized also plays a role in our understanding of their historic significance, although I'm not going to say too much about that today. One of the things is that missionary sources have gained a great deal of attention, particularly the official publications. They've even been studied as a genre in their own right called missionary literature, which is characterized by a propagandist intent and a highly regulated content, says Anna Johnson. This formal literature is extensive, it's well known, it provides valuable information, and the accessibility of this literature has played a role in its use. So scholars have used large missionary societies of mainline churches in Europe and USA because their archives are often housed in academic institutions or are easily accessible. There's at least some funding for maintenance and for cataloguing and so forth. And the Church Missionary Society provides a good example of this official missionary literature. The archives that are housed in Birmingham are a vast collection of institutional papers and correspondence with missionaries. And the CMS also produced a variety of periodicals intended to promote its aims and increase its support, and they targeted different audiences. So detailed and informative articles in the Intelligenta, a more popular approach in the Gleaner, things for those interested in medical missions, publications for children, and so on and so forth. Annual reports as well. And like the publications of other missionary agencies, they were predominantly written by men. But they do include letters and reports from women like Fisher and Pike, and they do include occasional reports from indigenous church leaders like Kivubulaya, and even we have a letter from the King and Queen Mother of Toro in one source. So a huge quantity of reportage of events, characters, strategies, and statistics. But if we rely only on the source of official missionary literature, we're liable to emphasize the institutional concerns of the organization in the metropole, the interests of the missionary supporting public, and the way in which the mission field was conceived in the metropole. But if we take missionary writing as being much wider than that literature, much wider than that published or connected with the headquarters of the society, I think we see another layer of understanding coming through. Missionaries published books of their experience, not all of which were published by missionary presses. They struggled with expectations of sacrifice and suffering, and although some of the narratives are tropes of heroism, persecution, and martyrdom that glorify the missionary endeavour, we can see in book-length treatments more complex narratives, longer memoirs that discuss death, lack of converts, friendships, loneliness, in much less stylized manners than we might see in the periodicals. And we also get European writers writing about Africans in various ways, and this is Kivu Bulaya is the subject of a number of popular biographies, and he is presented as a figure who British Christians should emulate. So Apollo the Pathfinder, who follows? Well, you, the British audience, follow him into the Congo jungle. So it's a kind of call, seeing him as a pioneer missionary, as an exemplary figure. We need also to consider regional publications. Uganda Notes is one such publication for that country. There is also a lot literature published in vernacular. So in Luganda, which became the dominant language at this time in Uganda, we have Abifa, that was supported by the CMS, and Muno, that was supported by the Roman Catholic White Fathers, and a whole host of other publications that came very rapidly after those two. We see in these publications a discussion of religious and social affairs, poems, proverbs, obituaries, accounts of customs and traditional ways of life. So the Ganda and the other people in Uganda who spoke Luganda were writing about their own customs and how they understood themselves at this period in history, and they're contributing to this. Kivu Bulaya wrote for Abifa, and he is eulogized in its pages after his death. And Henry White Duta, an early Ganda clergyman and prominent Bible translator, wrote for Abifa, but he also wrote for a Swahili magazine that came out of Tanzania or Zanzibar, where he'd studied. So they were passing information through these journals. And you can even see stories about Uganda appearing in Indian journals as well. So they're kind of swapping stories from across the globe. I think there are very porous borders between what might be called missionary writing and what might be called anthropology, geography, medicine, and so on. Many missionaries are contributing to a wider production of knowledge in a variety of academic disciplines. Ruth Fisher wrote a very popular anthropological work that I mentioned on the Nyoro, but it continues to be used by later anthropologists despite her popular style because of her interviews with local authorities on traditional ways of life. And the second anthropological work on the Nyoro was also written by a CMS missionary, the Reverend John Roscoe, who's better known for his classic work, the Buganda. That piece of work, he collaborated with another amateur historian and anthropologist, Apollo Kagwa, the Prime Minister of Uganda. And he published his own work in Luganda long before Roscoe published his. So you sometimes get the assumption that Kagwa helped Roscoe, but kind of worked off the back of him. I think it's the other way round. But there was a lot of collaboration on how they might categorize Ganda life. Fisher's husband became a member of the Royal Geographic Society after submitting a lengthy report on the Ruwenzori range. And we can look into these reports and try and discern who are the influential people, what can we discern about the pre-Christian past, for example, about shifting concerns of healing cults, the influence of African rulers on rituals of prosperity, and missionary commentary on these societies is inevitably infused with Christian assumptions. But even these assumptions don't conform to one understanding. Some, in broad sweeping terms, saw continuity between Christianity and African beliefs and practices and identified a connection between them. Others saw profound differences. There's also private papers that are worth remembering, like Fisher writing her journal in a preparation for official accounts. Many missionaries wrote private and round-robin accounts, letters to friends, family, home churches. They corresponded with other missionaries and with African colleagues. And these letters often contain more local detail and describe events incidental to those required by the missionary agencies. They have a warm, even intimate quality and are frequently frank in their accounts and opinions. So A.B. Lloyd and Kibalaya write to each other, my dear brother, my friend. There's a real intimacy in there, and these letters are in Luganda, so Lloyd is writing in Luganda. There's a real intimacy in these letters. They're more difficult sometimes to get hold of because not all of them have been deposited in archives, of course. Finally, in my list of missionary sources, I want to say that they're not limited to written texts. They include the visual and the material, and you see I put up some of the visual on these slides. The art of skilled missionary photographers demonstrates how photography allowed missionaries greater liberty than did their official written reports to examine indigenous cultures, and it reveals the complexity and ambiguity of the intercultural encounter. We can see this in the slides of Toro. There's lots of pictures that were taken by A.B. Fisher or Ruth Fisher on later Schofield that are really about the royal family, and the royal family are posing, and they're very, very happy to pose for these photographs, and there's a whole range of them in which they demonstrate their traditional rule. But of course, Toro was a very volatile entity. Pre-colonial, it was a very volatile entity, and it was really the colonial rule that enabled it to be a single unitary kingdom. And so what we see is sometimes the reinforcement of Kasagama's power. He had claimed, and he had a legitimate right to claim the throne of Toro, but it was enabled to be a single unit through colonial intervention. And in some ways, the CMS missionaries are promoting that cohesion. That's how they understand societal cohesion. And so they promote Kasagama, and Kasagama is an important figure in the Anglican Church. There are also artifacts that we could talk about. Paulo Kagwa actually gave Ganda royal and traditional objects to the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology in Cambridge, and in some ways is seeing himself as a collector and a donator of these pieces. So just to draw to a close, I started with the idea that historians of world Christianity often wish to provide a polyvocal perspective on historical events and have been a little bit nervous about missionary sources as perhaps getting in the way of that endeavour. I hope I've shown that missionary sources provide a rich seam of varied historical material, that they can't be understood as a single genre with a master narrative, and that they include publications to which indigenous Christian elites contributed, people who were, to one extent or another, engaged in a wider missionary project or part of those projects. So missionary sources may well echo changes in the metropole. Missionaries were influenced by status in their home societies and in the church and mission agency to which they belonged. They were influenced by their theological and cultural perspectives. They also demonstrate a number of aspirations. They wished to instigate change, individual spiritual change through conversion, medical and educational change. But on the flip side, many of them wished to protect African societies from too much change or from what they considered to be the wrong kind of change. And so they were very interested in understanding the peoples amongst whom they worked and their cultures. So I reject the view that missionary records of events were always at odds with the African perception of missionary endeavours, and that missionary documents can only at best hold a distorting mirror to change which they could not perceive clearly. A careful reading of these publications, which take account of the variety of genre, begins to collapse this grand post-colonial narrative and to show that even in situations where the asymmetries of political power loomed large, the encounters between foreign missionaries and indigenous people could include trust and friendship. And missionary sources are particularly informative about the participation of indigenous Christians in a global movement which comprised common threads as well as comprising of these local and distinct practices that we often focus upon. Nevertheless, as I said, in order to achieve this polyvocal perspective, missionary sources require triangulation with other sources, with oral history data, the work of local historians, with student dissertations. I found student dissertations in Congo and Uganda to be really illuminating, because often they are the people who are working with their own people and doing research in areas that would be very difficult to do research in. The private records and letters of early Christians are also important, and we could have a whole presentation on these. Without these other sources, the historian may find it difficult to maintain a focus on African participation in cultural change, and sometimes these sources take a little bit of time to find. I think another thing that these sources do is they challenge a familiar periodization. They allow for the inclusion of healing or renewalist movements that existed prior to missionary arrival, for example, of seeing the arrival of missionaries not necessarily as the starting point in a debate, but perhaps an answer to a set of questions that had been bothering people for some time. The diaries, letters and short autobiography of Apollo Kivubulaya have just provided one example of the perspectives of one who embraced religious change and who recorded his work of preaching and church planting. If Apollo Kivubulaya's sources are judged on the intent of their author, then his writings are every bit as much missionary sources as the records of European societies and their agents. His record illustrates the extent of the collaboration in a shared endeavour that Indigenous and foreign missionaries engaged with. And I think his record questions previous understandings of indigeneity and what we might expect from the Indigenous voices that we are so keen to seek.